about how, the basic essence of the universe is vibrational. That's the primary reality, and matter is just one of the states of reality, sort of like ice is a state of water, right? And so matter in the material world seem very concrete and very hard, but when you dissolve ice into water or even into steam, it is very malleable, infinitely malleable. And I think on the vibrational level, that's where our spiritual beliefs are, that things can be changed, and there's an alchemy there on that level that is, to us on the material level, miraculous. But music is one of the ways we get into that. So the next thing I started to talk about was how music is organized. It's kind of a subset of the universe in the vibrational plane, and we have this little subset of it, but it obeys similar laws, and that's why it speaks to us. And one of those is just the yin and yang. Okay, there's and one of the big things about music, how it moves us with yin and yang, is it moves us through time with tension and release. And we talked about dissonance and consonance, and we talked about setting expectations and then varying those expectations, and then we talked about the going from confusion, like the beginning of the fourth movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which sounds very chaotic, and then these little themes come in and wander off, and these note, I don't remember the exact German, but he says not these notes, and then he goes da 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 da, right, and he comes into the order, the magnificent Ninth Symphony theme. The point is that there's others as well for this. One of those is solo and group. So we have call and response. We have this kind of, somebody says something and then there's a group, right? That contrast, that yin and yang, creates tension and release, right? You hear it and hear it again. You hear it and you hear it again, and then you hear it a little bit a variation. From Ray Charles, to a piano concerto. So a concerto is a kind of music that has a solo instrument, like a violin concerto or piano concerto or a flute concerto, versus the orchestra. So Beethoven's Fifth Piano Concerto, the Emperor Concerto, is a magnificent. It starts out just with the orchestra, and it's there for maybe 5 minutes, and then the piano comes in, and then there begins this dialogue, right? This conversation of the solo with the orchestra, solo and orchestra, solo and orchestra, and that's a very common, from call and response, from drumming groups, that the solo versus orchestra coordination and integration and dialogue is a way of creating tension and moving the music along. Another one is kind of what I would call home and not home, and that speaks more to harmony, but also patterns that are familiar. Jazz does this a lot. For example, they might start out, playing the melody of, my favorite things, ba-bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, and then they go off in some, astral, transcendent version of that, which you can't. You're not able to follow this at all. But then they come, and they find this home, and then they go off, and they come back, and they play with it, and then they go off, and they come back with this kind of what I call home and not home. And so in harmony, you'll start out with a key, and there's a certain kind of expectations within that key. Oh, that's going to go back home. And then Bach was one of the first to really explore the ability to modulate into other keys on the piano and keyboards, and go off into this other related key, but then a more distant key, and it's there, but it's not quite the same. And people will do this with what are called modes, which are just basically playing the scale but starting on a different part of the scale. And so it's kind of the same melody but not the same melody. This, again, home, familiar, and then not home. That's what I would call. So that creates tension and release. And sometimes parts of the song are remembered and familiar, and some are not. So the sonata form will start with a development part, and then actually they'll start with I have to remember this, the exposition. They'll say, here are the themes of this symphony, and you'll hear a few themes, and okay, that's great. And then they'll do what they call development and go not home anymore, and they're all over the place. And then they do what they call a recapitulation. They'll come back home, but they brought stuff with them. And this is actually parallel with the myth, the hero's journey, where the hero goes out to the strange land and comes back still himself. He's home, but he brought more baggage and he's got this thing. And so music goes through these kind of journeys in a microcosm all the time. Just a Beatles song that goes to the minor key and then comes back. That home, not home is very, very common as a way of creating tension and release. But I'd like to move on from those kind of things and just kind of summarize them. So dissonance and consonance are one way to create tension and release. And I'm not going to exhaust these at all, but there's not that many more. I would say then repetition to create expectation, and then variation from that. The opposite of that, starting with confusion and then coming into some clarity. Another way of tension and release. And then solo and group, right? One voice being answered or varied on with the group. Orchestra versus the solo instrument is another one. And then what I called home and not home, okay? Which I think is maybe not really, these aren't really musical terms in some ways. I'm trying to give you some musical examples, but what I want to get you a sense of is how music moves you, and notice, that feels like home and that doesn't feel like home, and now they came back and I like that, or I don't like that where's home, right? There are some crazy jazz musicians who just say, okay, there was this song once that we heard and we're going to extrapolate on it, you never heard it, but we're going to go crazy and we're going to never come back. Blah, come with us. And they go off and you're like, huh? They're very gifted, they're at an advanced level, and they're talking a harmonic language amongst themselves, and they're riffing, and you're getting glimpses of the level of musical interplay that they're doing, but you're missing maybe bass. There's no home for you. You're not seeing the patterns because they're so complex or so unfamiliar. So you will find things, we all know pieces of music that we've heard many times before, but they bring us back and they evoke other things, and that's a different kind of home, right? So these are emotional ways that music moves you, right? One of those is, of course, rhythm, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Right now, I'd like to kind of set the stage for the next lesson, and that is, I think that musical structures in general, because of this home not home, tend to like to be round. What do I mean by round? Round to music. That sounds, well, we have a music that's literally called a round, where someone, row, row, row your boat, and then someone else comes in and they stack it at staggered levels, and they harmonize, and they have this and clever. And one of the most beautiful ones is Pachelbel's Canon in D, but it's not strictly around. It's not very strict. It does some things to make it more interesting and tidy. And then there are more complex things like fugues. But most types of music tend to want to come home at the end, some grand cadence, something like that. But also there are structures within the structures that are also round, and certainly rhythm comes to mind. There's the idea of a wheel rolling, and rolling on. There's a cycle going on in the music that subconsciously or consciously you are aware of, and it feels, you feel lost sometimes. Where am I on the wheel? And then we come home. So music has a tendency to be round. We tend to like. There are all kinds of examples that prove the rule, that are exceptions, but generally, let's look at roundness, and that'll be our next chapter.